Hello, everyone, and welcome to Health Reform Beyond the Basics. Thank you for joining us for our fall series for coverage year 2024. Today's webinar is the first of two webinars in our fall series that will focus on enrollment issues for people who are immigrants, and this is immigration-related eligibility for health coverage programs. My name is Aisat Odiale, and I'm the Health Projects Assistant at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'll be moderating today's webinar, which we are presenting in partnership with the National Health Law Program. Beyond the Basics is a project of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. It's designed to provide training and resources to facilitate enrollment in the ACA health insurance marketplaces and Medicaid. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is a nonprofit policy organization. We are not a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Beyond the Basics is aimed at healthcare assisters, advocates, state and local officials, and others who help people get and keep their health coverage. This webinar is not intended for press purposes, and while we hope you will learn a lot, we are not able to offer continuing education credit for our webinars at this time. Here you can see the schedule of the webinars in our fall. Apologies, not the schedules. Automated captions have been enabled for this webinar. To view them, click on the More option with 3 dots at the bottom of your screen, or you should be able to see a closed caption CC icon at the bottom of your screen. All participants are muted and in listen-only mode. But if you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your webinar screen and type your question into the box. We will be monitoring questions and will pause for Q&A during the presentation. We may not be able to answer every question, but we will have a record of all of your questions and we'll use them as a guide for future resources and presentations. And of course, you can email your questions during and after the webinar to beyondthebasics@cbpp.org. And a quick reminder that you won't be able to click on your screen to go to any of the links shared in the deck, but I will put the slide deck for today in the chat where you can find all active links to everything shared today. And after today's webinar, we'll email a recording of this presentation along with the links to the slides and other resources. And we'll also post everything to the Beyond the Basics website. Here you can see the schedule of the webinars in our fall series. We still have a lot of great content for you for the next coming weeks. We'll cover resolving data matching issues, plan design and plan comparison strategies, the annual renewal process, and a second part to today's webinar on outreach and application issues for people who are immigrants, and our popular Tying It All Together webinar at the end where we come up with the most complex examples we can think of to help you understand how all the concepts in the series fit together. Though we will still cover the same core concepts we always do, we've added new examples throughout the series and of course, integrated updates as policies have changed. We're also pleased to be once again hosting a webinar in Spanish that focuses on enrollment issues most relevant for people who are immigrants and people who live in mixed immigration status households. We are excited to be celebrating 10 years of marketplace coverage as a part of our series this year. And as a part of the celebration, at each webinar, we'll be spotlighting veteran assisters from around the country. Today's webinar will cover immigration-related eligibility for health coverage programs, other important eligibility rules for families that include immigrants, and options for people ineligible for insurance affordability programs due to immigration status. Today's presenters are Shelby Gonzales, Vice President of Immigration Policy at CBPP, and Gabrielle Lessard from the National Immigration Law Center. Gabrielle specializes in the laws and policies affecting access to healthcare for low-income immigrants and their families. So now I will turn it over to Jenny Sullivan for our anniversary segment and to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, ISAT, and welcome everyone this afternoon. We're glad you're here. I'm happy to share today's featured assister as part of our celebrating 10 years of coverage celebration. This is Kevin Wayner. He's a Benefit Enrollment Center counselor at the Missouri State Health Insurance Assistance Program and a navigator with Missouri Connections for Health. Kevin has been a navigator since the fall of 2013 and has helped hundreds of people enroll, from farmers to people who are immigrants, early retirees, people with chronic illnesses, people who are self-employed, etc. And his advice to new assisters is to learn as much as you can about the Affordable Care Act and how the law intersects with the health insurance marketplace website. Learn about tax rules. What income counts as magi? What's the difference between a qualifying child tax dependent and a qualifying relative tax dependent? Reach out to healthcare providers and other agencies that work with people with low incomes to develop connections with the uninsured and underinsured. Kevin, we are grateful for your service, and we are happy to be sending you your very own Beyond the Basics anniversary tumbler, so keep an eye out for that in the mail. And I will say, if you were with us last week, you'll notice that we featured someone else from Missouri last week. We will be featuring people from other states as well. This was just a happy coincidence, but thanks again, Kevin, for your service. And now I'm going to turn it over to, I believe, Gabrielle to start us off. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Take it away, Gabrielle.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to those of you who have been with us before. Next slide, please. We are going to be talking today about immigration status-related eligibility standards and health coverage programs. This graphic is something that we'll talk about later, so focus on it and burn it into your memory. I like to think about it as a big fried egg. So we'll be talking in general about two categories of immigrants and these are classifications of immigrants for public benefits purposes specifically. So the first category is the larger one of people who are lawfully present, also called lawfully residing. It's the same groups of people. And then the second is a subset of that group who are classified as qualified immigrants. Next slide. So qualified immigrants is the standard that's used by Medicaid and CHIP, as well as some other federal benefits programs. In general, qualified immigrants include lawful permanent residents. We call them LPRs. People are often called them green card holders or people with green cards. And then a number of different categories of people who have been admitted to the United States or allowed to remain for generally humanitarian purposes. So that includes people who are admitted as refugees, people granted asylee status, certain Cuban Haitian entrants, people who are granted admission into the country for humanitarian reasons, which is called parole. It has nothing to do with criminal parole. Conditional entrant is an older status you're not likely to see. People granted withholding of deportation or removal are actually similar to asylees in the sense that they can't go back to their home country safely. Certain battered or survivors of domestic violence, including their children or parents in many cases, as well as survivors of human trafficking, including their immediate relatives. Since 2021, people who are from certain Pacific Island nations who are under the Compact of Free Association are eligible and considered qualified immigrants for Medicaid only, and we refer to them as COFA migrants. There are also some immigrants who are not technically qualified, but who also meet the eligibility standards, and those include members of federally recognized Indian tribes or American Indians who are born in Canada, and people who hold special immigrant visas for nationals of Afghanistan or Iraq who assisted us in the wars in their country. I should have said at the outset that nobody is expected to come away from this webinar with this list of statuses memorized. This is just to get you familiarized with the concept and to give you materials for reference. Next slide. So in addition to limiting which lawfully present immigrants are able to qualify for benefits, there are also restrictions on when they can get them. Many qualified immigrants are actually barred from receiving Medicaid and CHIP during a 5-year waiting period, which begins on the date that the person obtains a qualified immigration status. There are a number of exceptions or exemptions to that 5-year bar. So people who are refugees, people granted asylum, and people granted withholding of deportation or removal. The Cuban Haitian entrants, people who have credit for 10 years of work in the United States, which you can sometimes get through family members. People who are from Iraq or Afghanistan who have or are in the process of applying for that special immigrant visa status, people who were paroled into the country from Afghanistan or Ukraine during certain date periods that are in the footnote there, survivors of human trafficking, the COFA migrants, and then people who are U.S. veterans, honorably discharged, or on active military duty, as well as immediate relatives, and people who came into the United States before the effective date of the law that imposed all these eligibility restrictions. We'll talk on the next slide about a state option that allows states to provide health care through Medicaid and CHIP to children and people who are pregnant who are lawfully residing and not just people qualified without a 5-year bar. Next slide. So again, under Medicaid and CHIP, states have the option to cover either children, and that is at the state option up to 19, 20, or 21 years of age, and or pregnant people. So these are two different options that are lawfully residing and receive federal matching funds for that coverage. So if you think back to that graphic, this is the outer larger circle, all of the lawfully residing people, not just the qualified immigrants. So people who are qualified, including people who would otherwise be subject to the 5-year waiting period, are able to get coverage immediately under this option. And then again, people who are lawfully present. Under this particular policy, the terminology is lawfully residing, so they have to be both lawfully present for immigration purposes and residents of the state for Medicaid or CHIP eligibility, which they would need to be anyway. And then through a majority of states have taken up this option. And then through a separate policy under CHIP, states are able to provide prenatal care during a person's pregnancy, regardless of that pregnant person's immigration status. So in addition to these options, which provide federal matching funds, states are able to use their own funds to cover people who do not meet the restrictive federal immigration eligibility standards. So a growing number of states are doing this. Oregon this year became the first state that covers all residents, who otherwise meet the income requirements, who, regardless of their immigration status. California is on track to do that as of the first of the year. Washington State has received a waiver that enables the state to let people use their healthcare marketplace and then receive subsidies through state funds. And again, Illinois covers various age groups. More and more states are coming on board, recognizing in the post-pandemic era, well, not really post, but during the pandemic era, that everybody needs access to healthcare, and we are all interconnected. Okay, no more editorializing from me. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so the lawfully present or residing statuses include all of the qualified immigrants that we talked about before, as well as other people who have lawful presence in the United States. So that includes people who have been granted relief under the Convention Against Torture, people granted temporary protected status, which allows people to remain in the US when something happens in their home country that makes it unsafe for them to return. Deferred and forced departures is very similar to TPS. People granted deferred action with the exception of people who receive deferred action under DACA. Now, there is a proposed change in regulations about that we'll spend some time on, but if it doesn't change by this open enrollment, important to know that you need to look at which category of deferred action a person has, and that at least under current policies, DACA recipients are not eligible. And then people who have that humanitarian parole, but for less than a year, people who have non-immigrant visas, as long as they're also able to establish residency, and then people who have a stay of removal, a discretionary form of immigration relief, lawful temporary residence, and family unity are statuses that are under older laws. You're unlikely to see people in those categories in 2024. Next slide. Then in addition, people who are applying for a number of different statuses are also considered to be lawfully present for marketplace eligibility or in those states that have exercised the option. So that is LPRs who have, applicants for LPR status who have an approved visa petition, people who have applied for special immigrant juvenile status, that's for abused or abandoned kids who have needed the protection of the courts, people applying for T visas, and then people applying for withholding of deportation or removal, either under immigration law or the Convention Against Torture. The people in that last category have to have employment authorization or have had an application pending for 180 days if they are under the age of 14. This is also true for applicants for asylum. And then a number of other applicants need to have employment authorization, including applicants for TPS, people applying for registry, which is a pathway to status for people who've been here for a very long time. I think it's since 1972. Order of supervision, that's for people who cannot be returned to their home country following a deportation order. Applicants for cancellation of removal or suspension of deportation, more discretionary relief. And then IRCA and Life Act are, again, older laws, and you're unlikely to see those people in 2024. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, there is a proposed regulation that would change some of these eligibility factors. And even though it affects fewer than 800,000 people, probably fewer than 700,000 people, it's a big victory for the field that CMS has finally proposed to eliminate the exclusion of DACA recipients from the definition of lawfully present. The proposed regulations would also eliminate the probably inadvertent exclusion of people who have applied for special immigrant juvenile status and then been granted it, because under the current regulations, only applicants are eligible. And then there would also be certain simplification of eligibility parameters that should make it easier for people to understand who's eligible, as well as for enrollers to get them enrolled. So in those categories where people who are applying for asylum, withholding, or relief under the Convention Against Torture are required to have employment authorization, children under 14 would no longer be required to wait 180 days. For non-immigrant visa holders, currently the regulations only make them eligible or lawfully present if they're not in violation of the status, which is really not something you can determine through a healthcare enrollment process. So that language would be eliminated. People with employment authorization are currently eligible only if they have certain categories of employment authorization. This would eliminate those subcategories and just make it clear that anybody who needs to apply for a grant of employment authorization is eligible. And then people who are applying for adjustment to LPR status, it would eliminate the requirement that they have an approved visa petition. Next slide. So this just shows what the lawfully present statuses would be following the finalization of those proposed regulations. And notably, you can see here that DACA is now included in the groups of deferred action for which people would be able to be classified as lawfully present. Next slide. And then again, the applicants, it gets rid of the 180-day waiting period for vulnerable children applying for humanitarian relief. And it would also get rid of that requirement that LPR applicants have an approved visa petition. Yeah, that's it. Okay, next slide. All right, so I will hand it over to Shelby at this point.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle, and thank you for Beyond the Basics for another great opportunity to provide information during this wonderful training that and for all of you all that keep on coming back, and for those of you that are new to this training, I hope that you get a lot out of it and know that we are here as resources and glad to answer questions, as oftentimes all of this information can sometimes be really hard and tricky, and you know, that's why none of us think that you need to like memorize all of this. We hope that the charts we provide you in these slides, you know, act as a good resource for you to come back to. And of course, you're always welcome to send emails to Beyond the Basics, and we'll do what we can to get back to you. So I'm going to go ahead and do the easier part. Gabrielle did the hard part, going through all of the different eligibility standards, and I'm going to give you some examples of how this might look for a family. So next slide, please. So the first example I'm going to share with you, we have Ricky and Ava, and they're married, and they have a daughter, Karina. And Ricky has temporary protected status, and Ava has DACA. Karina is a U.S. citizen, and in this scenario, all three of these family members are going to be applying for coverage. So we're going to see what would happen to them when we think about their eligibility just based off of their citizenship and immigration status. Next slide, please. So Ricky first, and Ricky is applying for health insurance coverage, and he is not a citizen. He has TPS. Is TPS a qualified immigrant? Does that make him nope, it does not. So it's not relevant whether or not he's subject to the 5-year bar, but his status, while it does not meet the eligibility requirements for the standard federal definition of Medicaid, you know, the qualified immigrant status, he is lawfully residing or lawfully present. So yes to that. And that means for him, he may be eligible for marketplace coverage. Next, we're going to have Ava, and she's applying for coverage, and she's not a U.S. citizen. She has DACA. She has deferred action for childhood arrivals. She's not a qualified immigrant. So again, the 5-year bar is not relevant because she doesn't meet the first criteria of it, and she does not meet the definition of lawfully residing or lawfully present. So she is not eligible for marketplace coverage, Medicaid, or CHIP based off of her immigration status. Next, we have Karina, and she is applying for coverage. She's a U.S. citizen. So all of the other questions are not relevant for her. She meets the citizenship requirement for Medicaid CHIP or for marketplace coverage. So next slide, please. So what we did here is, and you'll see in red, it says, well, what would this look like? What would the situation look like for this family in the event that the HHS rule that was proposed in April were to be finalized? And in this case, everything stays the same for Ricky, and it stays the same for Karina. But for Ava, it changes, because Ava, now, you know, with her status as DACA, would now be considered to be lawfully residing or lawfully present, so she may be eligible for marketplace coverage under this scenario. Again, as Gabrielle mentioned, and as we know more broadly, is that this rule has not been finalized yet. We don't know when and if. We're very hopeful that it will be, but we also understand that rulemaking takes a long time often, and it's hard, and it's not, just because it's proposed does not mean it's finalized. So we are waiting. We are very, very hopeful, and every day we're looking at that Federal Register and seeing if something comes up. We will be getting information out through Beyond the Basics if and when we see a final rule. So more information to come on that front. Next slide, please. I'm going to cover other important eligibility rules that sometimes come up for families that include immigrants as well. Next slide, please. So first, I call it the special premium tax credit rule, and it is perhaps one of the most confusing rules to talk about that I can think of in the marketplace, and there are a lot of confusing rules. This one is somewhat counterintuitive because the general rule for premium tax credit eligibility is that you must have income above the poverty line, above 100% of FPL, to be able to qualify for premium tax credits. And indeed, we see how this plays out in states that have not expanded Medicaid, where people find themselves, people with lower incomes below 100% of the federal poverty line, they find themselves in what we call the coverage gap. And that is a terrible place to find yourself, right? We want people to have access to coverage. So it is really, 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 really devastating when that happens. This plays out very differently for people who meet the marketplace's immigration requirement, but are ineligible for Medicaid due to their immigration status. So as we've talked about and we've shown you in the other slides, is that Medicaid is more restrictive, far more restrictive when we think about who is eligible based off of their immigration status. So far more, how Gabrielle showed you that fried egg diagram earlier in the conversation. We see the big universe of people who have lawfully present, lawfully residing statuses, and then a much smaller universe of people who meet the Medicaid immigration status requirements. So when the ACA was being developed, when it was being written, there was no interest among lawmakers, or very little interest, I should say, in making sure that people they didn't want to expand eligibility based off of immigration status for Medicaid or CHIP. But again, when we think about the ACA and the idea of being able to get most people access to health coverage, the way that the lawmakers created a pathway for people who are immigrants, but that are lawfully residing, lawfully present in the U.S., but are not that don't meet the very, very strict Medicaid requirements. The way that they did it was they created a special rule, and this is the special rule. The PTC for premium tax credit income, there is no floor. In terms of 100%, people can have income below the federal poverty line and still qualify for premium tax credits if they are lawfully present, but they are not eligible due to their immigration status. Okay, this includes people who do not have qualified statuses. So remember Ricky in the example, he has TPS, right? He has temporary protected status. That is not a qualified immigration status, but it is a lawfully present status. He would fall into this situation where he could have income below the poverty line and still qualify. And there are other people who have qualified immigration statuses, such as people, with lawful permanent resident statuses, also known as green cards. People who have those statuses, but they have not met the 5-year bar yet, they may also be able to get premium tax credits even if their income is below the federal poverty line. So the bottom line is that many people who have a lawfully residing, lawfully present immigration status and incomes in the Medicaid range or below 100% of the federal poverty line could qualify for premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions if they meet all of the eligibility requirements. Next slide, please. So I have another scenario because I know that this is a complicated rule, and we figured that it's sometimes easier to just kind of think about this from a family perspective. So in this case, we have Gina and Adnan, and they're married and they have a son named Sam. Gina has had LPR status for 2 years, and Adnan entered the US as a refugee. Sam has US citizenship, and we're going to say Sam already has Medicaid coverage. So we're just going to worry about Gina and Adnan for this example. Both Gina and Adnan are full-time students and both work part-time, and they project their income will be at 90% of the federal poverty line. Next slide, please. So let's think about Adnan first. He's applying for coverage. He's not a citizen. He's a refugee. Is he a qualified immigrant? Yes. Is he subject to the 5-year bar? No, because as a refugee, having that status as refugee makes it so that he does not have to be subject to the 5-year bar. So he could potentially be eligible for Medicaid or for marketplace coverage based off of his immigration status. For Gina, she's applying for coverage. She's not a US citizen. She has LPR status, a lawful permanent resident, which is a qualified immigrant. Is she subject to the 5-year bar? Yes. And has she met it? No, she has not met the 5-year bar in our example. She is lawfully present. She would be eligible for marketplace coverage based on her immigration status. Next slide, please. So let's put it all together. So let's say first in a state that has expanded Medicaid, and most have, thank goodness. Adnan has refugee status and his income is at 90% of the federal poverty line. He is eligible for Medicaid based off of both having a qualified immigration status that's not subject to the 5-year bars. That's what's happening on the immigration side. And his income is below the 138% of the poverty line. So it's below that. There's a little typo there that's missing. But his income is below the 138% of the federal poverty line. Gina has had LPR status for 2 years, and her income is at 90% of the federal poverty line. She is eligible for enrollment in the marketplace with PTCs. So she has a lawfully present immigration status, but she's not eligible for Medicaid based off her immigration status, right? So even though her income is below the poverty line, she would still qualify for a premium tax credit because she's ineligible for Medicaid based off of her immigration status, yet she's lawfully present. Next slide, please. This looks very different when you are in a state that has not expanded Medicaid, right? The result is different for Adnan. Adnan has refugee status. His income is below the poverty line, and he's ineligible because his state chose not to expand Medicaid, and he's ineligible for PTCs in the marketplace because his income is below 100% of the federal poverty line. He is not eligible for that special rule because he is eligible for Medicaid based off of his immigration status. So he falls into the coverage gap, just like many, unfortunately, many people across our country are in this situation. Gina has had her LPR status for 2 years and her income is below the poverty line. She is eligible for enrollment in the marketplace with PTCs based off of she's lawfully present, but she's ineligible for Medicaid based off of her immigration status. So nothing's changed for her in the 2 states, right? Whether she's in a state that's expanded or a state that has not expanded, nonetheless, the special rule applies to her. Next slide, please. So another rule to take into consideration is a special marketplace rule for older adults. So in general, people who are over 65 are not eligible for premium. in general, there are most people that are 65 have coverage through Medicare, right? But there are older adults that are not eligible for premium-free Medicare Part A. And in those cases, they may be eligible for enrollment in marketplace plans or premium tax credits and cost sharing reductions. I got to say that it's tricky, and there's a lot to take into consideration when helping people that are in this kind of situation. And to me, the best practice is if you can also talk with somebody who is very skilled and knowledgeable about Medicare when helping people in these types of situations, because things can get pretty tricky. So to qualify for premium-free Medicare Part A, individuals must have met applicable work history requirements. Basically, they have to get what we oftentimes refer to as Social Security quarters of earnings. And generally, that means they have worked for about 10 years full-time, or they also can sometimes get some of these credits because of their spouse's work history as well. So, applying for Medicare and getting Medicare, it is important that people don't miss certain deadlines. They could have very, very long lasting fees that would be, that basically are they're permanent, they're very steep. So again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have somebody that you might want to work with that is an expert on the Medicare side of things when helping older adults. I'm going to go through a scenario, next slide, to give you an example of when things might work out for somebody. And in this case, we have Lynn, who's 74, and who lives with his daughter, May, and grandson, Michael. Lynn has had lawful permanent resident status for 4 years. He has never worked in the US, okay? He receives $2,500 a year from a pension for work that he completed abroad. He is not enrolled in Medicare Part A. May provides more than 50% of Lynn's support. She claims Lynn and Michael as tax dependents, has household income of about 200% of the federal poverty line. So Lynn could be eligible for coverage in the marketplace. He has basically, a lawful permanent resident status. He meets the immigration status requirement. Lynn is eligible to enroll in subsidies, even though he's over 65. He's not eligible for premium-free Medicare Part A because of his work history. As we talked about beforehand, this is a situation where it's not like Lynn is gonna, he's done working, right? He's never worked in the US. He doesn't have any quarters of 10 years worth of credits that he would ultimately need. He would need 40 quarters, which is a long path, right? So this is a case where we'd be thinking about, okay, well, I would still want to know what it would look like for him to pay for premium Medicare Part A, but then also you want to take into consideration what are his possibilities and options in the marketplace. So in this case, it looks like he might be able to get subsidies based off of May's income. So next slide, please. So Lynn can apply this is a question that comes up oftentimes in these kinds of situations or scenarios similar to this family. People will ask, well, can't Lynn just just say that he's going to apply for himself? Like he can just be his own taxpayer and claim the $2,500 and that's it. Well, it is really important that if Lynn can be May's tax dependent, then that does not change just because of the eligibility, for marketplace coverage. You would want to file taxes the way that makes sense. And Lynn lives with May, right? And he's also her relative, right? May pays for more than half of his support, and Lynn's gross income is less than $4,700, he meets all of the criteria to be May's tax dependent. Lynn is May's tax dependent, so he cannot apply for PTC on his own as a household of one. He may be eligible for PTC, but he must include May and her income on his application for health coverage. So if Lynn receives a PTC, May must file a tax return and reconcile his PTC on her return as well. Next slide, please. So state residency for Marketplace, Medicaid, and CHIP. And we are basically, we're giving you the general rules. They're, especially on the Medicaid side, it gets a little bit more lengthy, but in general, what's going to be covered under the vast majority of people that you run into is that the ACA and Medicaid and CHIP residency is the state that an individual lives and intends to reside, including without a fixed address. So there's no second test to say, well, what's your address then? And, make sure that somehow verifying that that's not a requirement in Medicaid CHIP or the Marketplace. People can also have entered with a job commitment or seeking employment, whether or not they're currently employed, the state, and they would meet the residency requirement as well. So, one thing that comes up in the immigration world sometimes are like farm workers. Like maybe a farm worker goes and is now going to be living, maybe they have a job commitment. They're going to be living in that state. The fact that they came in with a job commitment, they are planning to reside in the state. So that would make them meet the residency requirement for the purposes of Medicaid CHIP and Marketplace coverage. To verify residency, states and marketplaces can accept self-attestation. They can use HHS-approved electronic sources to the extent that they exist. They cannot use evidence of immigration status to make a decision about this. Next slide, please. This is another tricky area that has come up for many people over the years. When I say many, it's over the years. This isn't like something that there's like, oh, there's a huge numbers of people that come into this situation, but there are some. And over the years, then we've seen many. So PTC related rules for people who are married and who have non-resident status. Non-resident status being a status that is as it pertains to the IRS and tax filing, not as it pertains to specific statuses for the purposes of Marketplace coverage. That this is about a IRS rule and how they treat certain tax filers. So to qualify for a PTC, an applicant that's married must file taxes jointly with their spouse. So that is the Marketplace and PTC rule that comes into play for certain families that are married. Certain people who are immigrants, they file taxes on Form 1040 NR, NR standing for non-resident, okay? Some people who have non-immigrant visas, and some examples include students with F visas or people with J or M or Q visas, they must file taxes on Form 1040 NR because they can't meet what's referred to as a substantial presence test in their first 5 years in the US. So Form 1040 NR does not allow most people who are married and have non-resident immigration status to file jointly with a spouse. So they can't meet the joint filing requirement to claim a premium tax credit. So this has come up, and then some not fabulous things happen when you're reconciling the tax credits later on. So it's worth it when you are, encountering people with F visas, J visas, MQ, and at least begin to ask a little bit more questions in this case about their filing status and whether or not they are able to file jointly. There are certain, because of treaties, there are certain countries that people might come from that this does not apply to them. So just keep in mind that this is complicated and it can be tricky for people. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it back over to Gabrielle.
Thanks, Shelby. Okay, so let's move on to talk about what are the options for people who are not eligible for assistance because of their immigration status. Next slide. So this is primarily something that affects people who are undocumented and people who, under the current rules, have DACA. So they are not eligible to purchase qualified health plans in the marketplace, even without subsidies, with the exception of Washington State, where they got a waiver. So they are able to purchase private coverage outside the marketplace. And if they're employed, they can get coverage through their employer. One thing that we run into is that insurance brokers who people go to purchase coverage outside the marketplace often don't understand that people without social security numbers or other tax identification numbers are able to purchase those plans. So that is a specific technical assistance question that you can certainly bring to me, but people are not required to have those. If you look at the 1095 reporting forms, they explicitly contemplate that there will be people covered who do not have a social security number or other tax ID. Next slide. Now, next slide, please. Okay. So there is a program for people who are eligible for their state's Medicaid program, except for the immigration status requirements. So they meet the income and residency and any other categorical requirements, but they don't have a qualifying immigration status. Those people are able to get emergency Medicaid, which is coverage for specific serious healthcare conditions. So people who might be enrolled in that program include not only undocumented people and DACA recipients, but people who have a qualified status, but are subject to the 5-year bar and have not met the 5-year bar requirement, as well as people who are lawfully residing, but not qualified, like people who have temporary protected status. Next slide. And then there are a number of programs that don't restrict eligibility based on immigration status. So that includes programs that are funded using federal healthcare block grants. Those include mental health, maternal and child health, family planning, communicable disease, and immunization programs. Also not restricted are programs that provide health services necessary to protect life or safety, hospital financial assistance programs for charity care, community health centers, which are also called federally qualified health centers, and migrant health centers, and then again, additional programs in some states that have been using their own funding. Next slide. Okay, I think I skipped a slide here, which is the slide that says that people who do not have an eligible status themselves are able to use the marketplace to apply for coverage for their qualifying family members. And we usually think of this as an undocumented parent with citizen kids. If that person is the taxpayer in the household and is applying on behalf of their family members, they do need to file a tax return in order to receive the advanced premium tax credits. And undocumented people can receive a tax ID number called an ITIN, or individual tax identification number, in order to do that. And want to add one more thing, which is to thank Aram for reminding me that I should have said that people who are exempt from the 5-year bar because they are a refugee or have another exempt status are not then subject to the 5-year bar when they become lawful permanent residents. So I will turn it back over to Jenny now for Q&A.
It's actually going to be Ayasat who runs our Q&A, but she'll take it away from here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabrielle and Shelby, for all that important information. And so to follow up with that, we have a lot of good questions in the chat for you both. So to start off, a question is regarding children and pregnant people at state option. Is there a list of states and their options?
Yes. Actually, I believe that we have a list of the states and their option, the states that have taken up this option on the slide where we talk about the state option. So at the bottom, they'll say, to find out more information about state options in your state, see NILC's Medicaid assistance programs for immigrants in various states. So that's a good resource that talks about different state funded options.
And then
go ahead.
In addition to that, Shelby, we have state health coverage maps.
Perfect.
That will show people at a glance which options their states have taken up.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Perfect. And before we end this session, I'll make sure to drop the slide deck again one more time in the chat. So thank you. So another question is, since DACA recipients are not eligible, what are options for DACA consumers?
Okay. Many DACA recipients get coverage through their employers, but then for the DACA recipients who don't receive employer-supported coverage, they unfortunately have the same options that I just talked about for undocumented people, such as buying coverage off exchange without receiving any subsidies. And then again, there are a number of states that will cover people up to a certain age or beyond, regardless of their immigration status, or that cover DACA recipients under a particular quirky category, and that's primarily California and New York.
All right. Thank you, Gabrielle. So this question pertains to slide 28 with Lynn and May. Even if May did not claim Lynn on her tax return before and did not plan to, she should for the year of coverage in the situation. Sorry, let me read the question. Even if May did not claim Lynn on her tax return before and did not plan to, should she for the year of coverage in the situation described on the slide?
I mean, I'll be honest, I don't see why May would not have. I mean, it would make a pretty big difference on her own tax return. To not take a dependent who clearly qualifies for her to be a tax dependent would leave her, with a financial, she would be that would not make sense for her from a tax perspective. And in this case, May does not have a tremendous amount, very high income in terms of, and she's single mom. You're thinking about, if we're really being honest about what this circumstance looks like, I can't imagine why she would not have claimed Lynn as her dependent that she could be claiming. So yes, it's true that we're not, when we think about it, when we're helping people apply for coverage, we're not telling them tax advice. But I would have a hard time, and one of the reasons why we wrote the scenario this way, to make it so that it's not super obvious that there would be a question as to whether or not she would claim him as a dependent.
Awesome, thank you. So another question is, can you discuss public charge? When does it come into play, if it does?
Sure. Gabrielle, I can start and then maybe you can jump in if I miss anything.
Okay, and I think we will be talking about public charge in the next webinar, correct?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say, well, the good news is that there's two pieces of good news. One, we'll get into much more detail at the next webinar about public charge, as well as many other aspects of, what happens with consumers when they encounter the application process. So that's going to be, information that we cover. But the short answer is that public charge, when an individual is going through a public charge assessment, and that they are not going to, having received or participated in Medicaid CHIP or the marketplace is not going to negatively be a negative factor in a public charge assessment. The only time Medicaid could potentially become a negative factor, which, by the way, when I say it's a negative factor, doesn't mean that disqualifies them or makes them somehow, considered for now on a public charge. It just means that it's a negative factor when making a public charge assessment for an individual. The only time Medicaid could be a negative factor in that public charge assessment would be when an individual is in a long-term care facility that is being paid for by Medicaid or at the government's expense. But this doesn't even include like, I had to go to a rehabilitation center after surgery or whatever. Like, that is not what we're talking about. It's really when people are in a long-term care, like a nursing home, that kind of institution. Gabrielle, I don't know if there's more you want to share before we talk about it more in the next webinar.
I just want to add that many categories of immigrants, and this is in very broad terms, people admitted for humanitarian purposes, are exempt from public charge.
Yeah, that's important.
So it primarily affects people who are on family-based petitions.
Yeah. And one other thing, we'll just go on about this now. I'm just going to keep on talking. The other thing too is that when we think about who could potentially go through a public charge assessment and whose benefit use is taken into consideration during a public charge assessment, they're looking at the individual's use of benefits. They're not looking at the child of the individual's use of benefits. That's also an important thing to take into consideration, because oftentimes people are, quite frankly, they're not eligible for the benefit like Medicaid at all, right? For at least 5, there's just a lot of people who this isn't applicable to them because in any event. But anyway, we could go on for a long time on
and
this.
There's also a question, what is a public charge? A public charge is a category of inadmissibility, meaning that the government can deny a person a visa or permission to become a permanent resident. And for public charge specifically, it's if they are expected to become primarily reliant on the government for their expenses of daily living.
Thank you both for that. And so one last question, just to close us off, is, so we're getting a lot of questions about the special rule for marketplace coverage for people with income less than 100% of the FPL. Can you go over again how that works in Medicaid expansion versus non-expansion states, and whether people who are immigrants need to do anything special on the healthcare.gov application to get determined eligible for PTCs when their income is under 100% of poverty?
Sure. There's no difference in the eligibility for the PTCs for an individual with their income below the poverty line, whether they're in a state that has expanded or has not expanded Medicaid. That's the number one thing. Number two, you ask a little bit about the process, right? But actually, let me just back up a little bit and just say, so I'm going to just do a recap, right? If an individual is eligible for the marketplace based off their immigration status, so they have a lawfully present status, but they're not eligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status. They have a status that's not qualified, or they haven't met the 5-year bar, those kinds of things, right? Then, if their income is below the poverty line, they can still get a PTC. If their income is in the Medicaid range, they can still get a PTC, right? So that's sometimes people are like, well, what if their income's at 134 and they're in a Medicaid place? Well, they're not eligible for Medicaid. They just stay at the marketplace. It doesn't really matter. They're just the key point is that when you have this situation, a person has a lawfully present status, but they're ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, they are eligible for premium tax credits, even if their income is below the poverty line. But getting the correct eligibility determination sometimes is challenging. So that's a smart question that was asked, because it's not always perfect. And we will go through this in detail in the next webinar. We're doing like all these commercials for the next webinar. But what's important to remember is that for people who put in the numbers that healthcare.gov asks of them, when it's time to do their application, and they say, can you put in your immigrant number, or your whatever number that is relevant to them based off of the kind of document they have to prove their status. They put those numbers in, and if healthcare.gov understands and can verify electronically the information that they provided about their status, healthcare.gov will make the correct eligibility determination for PTCs, even if the income is below the poverty line. Okay, nothing more needs to happen if their income is if their status is able to be verified electronically. The problem comes when people can't have their immigration status verified in real time electronically through healthcare.gov. When that happens, everybody has to provide more documentation to prove, right? When this happens, we call it a DMI, and people have to provide proof of their whatever the factor is that they would have to provide. When that happens, healthcare.gov doesn't know that you meet this special rule requirement, right? So what you would have to do is you would probably have to clarify that you would have to clear that eligibility hurdle by providing documents to healthcare.gov. If that's what happened to you, you stayed at healthcare.gov, and then once it's been cleared, you can go in and say that now you can get PTC eligibility, and you can go through the process of the questions that are being asked in the application. But if you are in a state where it looks like you might really be eligible for Medicaid, then what will happen is the marketplace might send you to Medicaid. They'll think that you're eligible for Medicaid, right, during this while you get the documents. And that is a really slow process, because then what happens is you get sent to Medicaid, and Medicaid then it's going to be like, wait a minute, you need to provide us proof of your immigration documentation. And then while that happens, and then you get denied, then you would then be sent back to the marketplace. And we all know people start losing coverage during this time. So this is an issue. It comes up. It's not great. If you know that somebody has been determined ineligible for Medicaid based off of their immigration status, over the last couple of years, there's always a new date that they put into the application. There's a question in the application that says I've been determined ineligible for Medicaid based off of my immigration status over, I can't remember. Every year they put a different date in. But if it's true that this is an individual who has been determined ineligible based off of the immigration status within that time frame, then that individual can check off that it has to be true. And that will resolve the issue as well. And then they can stay in the marketplace. They will have to prove their immigration status at the marketplace, and they will get the right PTC eligibility as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby, and thank you, Gabrielle. Here are the resources that were shown in today's slide, which will be available on our website and will be sent out after. And here are the contacts for Gabrielle, Shelby, and just general inquiries to Beyond the Basics. Thank you all for staying on a couple more minutes after our next webinar, Preventing and Resolving Data Matching Issues, is scheduled for next Thursday, September 28th at 2 p.m. And you can register for this and other webinars on our website under upcoming webinars. So with that, that will be all. And thank you so much for joining.